Lisa, it's a pleasure to be with you, as always, and I've deeply appreciated over the years the many things I've learned from you, and I've been particularly impressed by your new book, Invisible Chains, and Overcoming Coercive Control in Your Intimate Relationships, because it's a whole new paradigm and focus for people that work with families and couples and individuals in situations where there's violence.
Janine, it's great to be here with you, and I've certainly learned a ton from you, and I hope I'll continue to learn a lot from you over the years as well.
So I'm curious, what took you into writing this book? What passions, what interests, and maybe before even you say a little bit more about that, a quick overview of some of what's included in the book.
Sure. The book talks about coercive control, which is a form of couple violence in which one person, usually the man, controls the woman through a variety of strategies. They can include, they don't necessarily include all of these, but they can include manipulation, isolation is very important, sexual coercion, punishment, threat, and sometimes, but not always, physical violence. And we think about not all families, not all couples that have violence have coercive control, but many of them do. And if we think about couple violence as being within a framework of control, it really changes the way we view it. We don't see it simply as discrete episodes of violence, but rather as a whole system of control. And then the focus changes from he has to stop hitting to they need to interact in a way in which she is a free and autonomous human being, or she may need to leave the relationship. So it's a complete shift of focus. And I really have to give a lot of credit to Evan Stark. Evan Stark wrote what is, as far as I know, the first book on coercive control. It's called Coercive Control. It's about 500 pages, and it's very, very comprehensive, a lot of legal information. I read that book, and the concept made a ton of sense to me in terms of the couples and families that I've been working with over the years. So I really felt that there was a need to write a different kind of book, which would be accessible to professionals, but also accessible to people who are being victimized or who have friends who are being victimized. My goal is to write a very user-friendly book. The language is simple. The ideas aren't simple, but the language is very simple, so it's easy for people to grasp. At least that's my goal. And
I would say that you've very well met that goal.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Because it is language that is very nuanced and yet very available, and people can tease out the complexity of the ideas with the help of your very clear explanations.
Well, that's good to hear. So I wanted people to be able to read it, recognize themselves in it, and figure out a strategy to become freer people, whether they can do it within the relationship or outside the relationship. And I also wanted a book that would be helpful to professionals to think about the concept of coercive control. It is so different from thinking about domestic violence as a series of blows or a series of violent incidents. And it calls on different things. It requires a different response from therapists, and it requires a different response from law enforcement, and it also asks for a different response in people who are being victimized.
Mm-hmm. And I think the framework that you presented in the sense that it is something that is a resource for people in many different areas of work with women, or for that matter, you include transgender people within, and you think about particular different situations that women might find themselves in, like being an immigrant within a country. I think the fact that you have thought about the different perspectives that somebody who's coming from a position of being, a policeman or a therapist, for example, and how they might read this book, but also how the women might find themselves in very different types of situations And there's good information in there as well for men who want to change their behaviors. So you've made a kind of a lattice that provides a context that people can enter into the information from many, many different perspectives, which is, you don't find that in a lot of books that might be sometimes called, self-help books. It's a very sophisticated self-help book.
Yeah, well, I hope it really will be a self-help book. I mean, I really hope it's the kind of book that people will give out to their clients in psychotherapy, to their people who are in shelters, to women who are in shelters. Maybe doctors will give to their patients. But I also picture the opposite happening. I picture that there may be, let's say, a woman who picks it up in a shelter and gives to her therapist because she realizes that the kind of response she's getting from the therapist isn't really adequate. The therapist doesn't understand the dynamic and may say, a woman might say something like, I don't own the real estate inside my own head. I feel like I'm a machine and he's pressing the buttons. And if the therapist doesn't have the background to really think about control, they may immediately try to move that into a systemic framework. A systemic framework is important, but we can't give up the concept of power. And so I think it's dangerous. I think sometimes women are very ill-served by therapists, and even therapists who mean well. I also did want to mention that in the book, it in no way demonizes men. Most men do not control their girlfriends or their wives in this way, and fortunately, increasingly, men are helping to work to liberate women from violence. There are some occasions when women dominate men in this way, but they're relatively rare. From what I've seen, partly because society supports men's dominance over women in so many ways that it makes this kind of control less likely. It's harder for a woman to isolate a man in the way that coercive control usually does. But in the situations where I've seen it, the rare situations, the men were in some way disabled. In one case, the man was in a wheelchair, and so he was very dependent and very isolated. He could be isolated from his world.
Because of his physical limitations.
In another case, he had bipolar disorder, and when he was depressed, he was practically catatonic, and he could be controlled. But situations, some women are bossy for sure, and some men are bossy for sure. We're talking about more than bossiness here. It's a system, yeah.
And I also deeply appreciated in reading the book how you give myriad ways in which women can get out of situations like this. And I don't know if you would like to maybe share a few of those ideas or link those to how people who are working, within JUCONI and other similar kinds of organizations, ideas that might be particularly helpful to them in their work.
Okay. And I'm glad you asked that because it made me realize that I forgot to mention one very important aspect of coercive control, which is stalking. And stalking can happen not just after a relationship, but within a relationship. If a woman feels that if her emails are being read, if she's being followed, if she has a GPS put in her phone so her partner knows where she is at all times, if he's going through her computer, if he's got a video camera hidden somewhere, if he's talking to her friends and saying, hey, let me know if she comes around, or talking to the store owner, or even telling his kids, let me know what your mother does today, which is so common. And
a woman can read that as, oh, he really cares about me, or he's looking, he's looking after me in some way, and yet.
And in the beginning, the relationships are usually good. And so those things are received as, oh, he loves me so much, he wants to come to the supermarket with me. And then later, she feels, I can never have time alone. In some cases, can't even close the door to the bathroom. She's not allowed to have that space. So I mention that because I think it's important for us to remember that it's not simply a case of a woman making a decision, let's say, I think I'll get out of here. I think I'm done. Often women try to get away and they are followed, often killed at the point at which they try to separate. So in the United States, at least, the men who end up killing their wives are not the ones who've been most violent previously. They're the ones who've been most controlling. A woman is usually the best judge of her risk.
Distinction.
Yeah. So I think that the first step is, well, who knows what the first step is, but one really important thing people can do is to stay in touch. If a woman is being controlled and isolated, find ways to stay in touch. Invite her out for a walk, call her on the phone, send her texts. I mean, in whatever ways you can stay connected, knowing that her partner may be looking at her texts or her emails. So you sometimes have to be careful.
So thinking about the wording.
Right, exactly. But continuing to invite her to events, continuing to give her the feedback, you're a good person. Because what happens when you're being insulted, humiliated, and you don't have contact with other people is that your view of yourself becomes based on the view your partner gives you. So staying connected is really important. Don't try to take control of the woman's life. She needs to make the decisions herself about what she wants to do. Giving her information. Sometimes women make the decision to leave if they see that their children are suffering, and children do suffer.
And asking them also to think about, like, what will it be like for your children if this continues for another 6 months or a year or
a lifetime,
5 years from now, because that, in a way, that can force them sometimes out of the kind of trance-like state in some ways that you can enter into when you're in a situation like that, being so controlled.
Yeah. So, and sometimes men, another tactic of control is to control a woman through her children by threatening them economically, by punishing them, by sexually abusing them, by threatening to take them away, either legally or just saying, I'm going to disappear and you'll never see them again. So that's a big arm. I think that I think it's a very important concept.
So asking about that, if those kinds of things are being done, because that's going to make it very difficult for a woman to see a way out of that situation.
Right. Yeah. So asking about all the different categories that I spoke about in a very respectful way, a non-shaming way, continuing to communicate appreciation for the person, and often being in social situations, being with other people, feeling understood and respected is very empowering. And I think that's one thing you asked me about JUCONI, some of the concepts that might be helpful for JUCONI. And I think that the notion of creating spaces where women who are fairly isolated can get together, can talk about their real lives is very important. They don't necessarily have to be psychotherapeutic spaces. Yeah.
But where they feel heard.
Yeah. And then, of course, having economic supports can help. But even women who are in good economic shape and educated can get caught in these relationships.
Thank you so much, Lisa, because I think you've given a rich entrance into your book, which is coming out shortly. And I hope that it's translated soon into Spanish.
I think it will be. That's the goal.
That's the goal, because then it'll be accessible to even more people, and it's a whole new arena for people to understand more of the complexities of relationships between men and women. That is a terrific resource. So congratulations, and thank you so much for our time together.
Thank you. It's always great to speak with you, Janine.